apologies, not getting into the actual debate of what I'm doing. I'm taking a bit of liberty here, and I've titled it a self-indulgent segue. It'll all become clear as we flow through it, and it's something a bit different, and I hope you enjoy it. This is Government House in Melbourne. It's the largest of all the government houses. It's huge. Not bad digs for a humble person like me as an ADC at the time. I was seconded from the RAF for a 2-year term as Governor to the ADC. ADCs to the Governor-General normally only do 12 months, but in this case I had double penalty, 2 years. Sir Henry and Lady Winnicky are pictured here. I found Sir Henry to be a great and inspiring person who was a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Victoria. He was a person was also not without a sense of humour. On 11 November 1975, about 6 months before I arrived at Government House, several hundred protesters had marched on Government House in Melbourne. Later, the police officer in charge told the Private Secretary, Charles Kerwin, a number of protesters had been arrested in the grounds and asked if the Governor wanted them charged. "Oh no," he said when Charles Kerwin put the question to him. "Tell him to do with them what they do with undersized fish. Throw them back." That said, life went on, and I accompanied the Governor on numerous functions in the Greater Melbourne area and also to the numerous shows throughout Victoria, often on the train. This photo is a rare sight, with 2 cars being hauled by diesel-electric locomotive. Usually the 2 cars were hauled at the front or at the rear of a normal scheduled service. He was very aware that he shouldn't be doing things that looked extravagant, so that's the way it often worked. This is the combined lounge and dining room of that. I have many other photos of the train, but not time to show you here. Also, there were 2 famous ladies who visited Government House while I was there. On 17 March 1977, Her Majesty the Queen of Australia visited Government House and, amongst other things, attended a luncheon in her honour as part of the Silver Jubilee functions. As part of that function, the guests who were attending the luncheon were to be corralled into groups in the State Drawing Room for presentation to Her Majesty. While the Queen was in private discussion with the Governor in the private drawing room, I made a dash along the hallway leading to the state side to see if all was in order. I was appalled to see that all was not as it should be. I quickly cracked a few whips with the honorary ADCs and then rushed back to the other side, only to see the Queen and the Governor on their way. I stared incessantly at the Governor to attract his attention, but to no avail. As they approached about halfway across the hall, private hall, I then turned my gaze to the Queen in desperation. After a few moments, the Queen noticed my steely glare. Without flinching, our very astute Queen turned her head to the right and said, "There's a photo of Princess Margaret." The Queen then started to walk to the piano where the photo of Princess Margaret and many others were placed. I then had time to rush back to the state side to check to see if all was in order, and it was, and then turned around at the doorway only to see the Queen and the Governor arriving. My bacon was saved that day by our Queen. The Governor had also made arrangements for me to attend that luncheon. During the luncheon, the Governor rose in his place and made a toast to the Queen, and the military band played the royal anthem. After a short period of time, the Queen herself rose and also raised her glass. I found that somewhat baffling, and later, and at the first opportunity, I asked the Governor what that was all about. He had been similarly baffled by the Queen's actions and had inquired of the Queen the reason for her standing. He simply replied that she had said that she was toasting the institution of the Crown itself. Another lady of great interest who visited Government House some 6 months earlier in September of 1976 was Margaret Thatcher. After a heavy round of functions in Melbourne, Mrs Thatcher requested a quiet night on the last evening. Accordingly, a small party of 6 sat around a small table in the private dining room. They were Margaret Thatcher, Sir Henry Winnicky, Dennis Thatcher, Mr Butler, who was Mrs Thatcher's private secretary, Lady Winnicky and Nick Hobson. So if you've joined the dots correctly, you will note that I sat to the right of Margaret Thatcher. As with all important guests, notes on the Governor and the Governor's personal staff were given to Margaret Thatcher beforehand. She would have been well aware of my military background before we sat down to dinner. Of course, I was aware of that, but was not expecting what followed. I barely had put the first fork of food in my mouth before the first question arrived about how did we do things in South Vietnam? The conversation between Margaret Thatcher and myself went on relentlessly and took up most of time at dinner. The Governor was not amused. He was stuck with Dennis Thatcher. Lady Winnicky was stuck with Mr Butler, and I was stuck with Margaret. Nonetheless, all was forgiven in the end. That said, and by comparison, I believe that George Negus only got the light version. Now to more important things, and other people who made up ACM's first National Council. I'll just whip through this very quickly. Firstly, Lloyd Watt, is he here yet? No? He is coming, I understand. Margaret Belady, an Aboriginal lady. I didn't see a lot of her, if I recall. Doug Sutherland, one of our former Lord Mayors of Sydney, marvellous man. Helen Sham Ho, the first person of Chinese background ever to be elected to the Australian Parliament, to an Australian Parliament. She was in the council here. Margaret Olley, a very famous painter, very lovely lady too. Barry O'Keefe, one of the most gentlest and kindest people you could ever meet. Brother of Johnny O'Keefe, if you didn't know, and he was also an ICAC commissioner. Vahoy Nafahu, born in Tonga where she was involved in women's issues, she migrated to Australia with her family in 1973. Dame Leonie Kramer, everybody would know about her, an academic and a Sydney University Chancellor. Michael Kirby, great guy. Angelo Hatzaturis, another good person. Stephen Hall. Now, Stephen Hall was the General Manager of the Festival of Sydney and also the Directorate of the New South Wales Directorate of Bicentennial Events. And that is where I met him because I worked for him. And so I was responsible for quite a few things on the big day. One of them was the flyby. I had asked for 200 aircraft up at Victoria Barracks one day, and the bottom jaw dropped. But I did note that we managed to get about 180 on the day for the fly past. So I'll give you a couple of photos. The first one is the Command and Control Centre that we used to control the whole day's functions. It wasn't what was going in us, it was what was going on around us. We had direct liaison with the airport and all sorts of things. And that was the view I had on the day, probably the best view ever. Gareth Granger, another great bloke and very helpful. Sir Harry Gibbs, another wondrous man. Because some of these people are now gone. Sir John Atwell, a great person also. And this man, a Jagera elder who served as a Queensland Senator from 1971 through 1983. And I thought we'd just hear a little bit of what he had to say. Oh, I'll have to get that back. Just bear with me for a moment.
I cannot see that such a political president, elected or appointed, would care one drop more for my people. From the bottom of my heart, I pray, stop this senseless division. Let us work together on the real issue. Let us solve those problems which haunt my people. The problem of land, of health, unemployment, of the despair and hopelessness which leads even to suicide. Let us unite this country, not divide it ever.
I honour this man today for all that he did for his country, his people, and also what he did for ACM. Sovereignty of the people, unfinished business. That's the subject of my talk today. Most of what I have to say today are extracts from my paper, Is Our Constitution Safe? Details about this document will be displayed on screen at the end of my talk. This can be a bit heavy for discussion. I'm not a lawyer. I'll set that straight up front. I did do Air Force law. I did have to listen to Sir Henry Winnicky a lot on points of law of an evening time over a whiskey. But I have spent a lot of time on this particular subject, and I think there are issues that we've got to deal with in the long term, and we'll get about that shortly. So what is sovereignty of the people? Most dictionaries describe sovereignty as supreme power. In a Sydney Morning Herald article of 29 July 2000, Israeli professor Ruth Lapidoff, when interviewed about Israeli-Palestine negotiations, said sovereignty is an abstract notion that makes people's feelings very strong. Blackshield and Williams wrote that broad statements as to the reposition of sovereignty in the people of Australia, if they are to be given legal rather than popular or political meaning, must be understood in light of the federal considerations contained in section 128 of the Constitution. Those statements must also allow for the fact that none of the Australia Acts, imperial, Commonwealth or state, follow approval at a referendum, in particular any submission to the electors pursuant to section 128 of the Constitution. There was the first downfall. Moreover, section 15 of the Australia Acts provide their own mechanism for amendment or repeal by statute without submission to the electors at a state or Commonwealth level. Let us now have a look at a short movie about the Australia Acts.
substantially identical terms, was enacted by the United Kingdom Parliament. The United Kingdom Act was pursuant to a request made and consent given by the Parliament and Government of the Commonwealth in the Australia Request and Consent Act 1985, and with the concurrence of all the states. The Australia Act, United Kingdom, gained its authority from Section 4 of the Statute of Westminster and was passed in case the Australia Act, Commonwealth, was found to be invalid. Section 12 of the Australia Acts repeals Sections 4, 9.2, 9.3 and 10.2 of the Statute of Westminster 1931, insofar as they were part of the law of the Commonwealth, of a state, or of a territory. With the introduction of the Australia Acts, the United Kingdom has implicitly abandoned its Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act of 1900 to the Parliaments of Australia for their local handling. In other words, there can be no doubt as to Australia being a sovereign and independent nation. On the 2nd of March 1986, Queen Elizabeth II, in her capacity as Queen of Australia, travelled to Canberra to assent to the proclamation to bring the Australia Act into operation, both in Britain and throughout Australia, on the 3rd of March 1986.
We'll now take a brief look at sections 1, 7 and 15 of the Australia Acts, both of which are relevant to this presentation. It's going to be a quick look. Section 1 of both the Acts terminates the power of the Parliament of the United Kingdom to legislate for Australia. It's a fairly important aspect. Section 7 of both the Acts details the powers and functions of Her Majesty and governors in respect of the states. And this is important for the later discussion that we'll get in, not discussion, but in my talk about that. Section 15 of the Acts provides for a method to repeal or amend the Australia Acts or the Statute of Westminster. Section 15.1 allows for the amendment or repeal of the Australia Acts or the Statute of Westminster by statute and without submission to the electors at state or Commonwealth level. However, Section 15.3 requires that any alteration to the Constitution of the Commonwealth be made in accordance with Section 128 of the Constitution, that is, the conduct of a referendum. It is interesting to note here that the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act is not mentioned in Section 15.3. However, Section 51, which mentions the Statute of Westminster, of which at Section 8 of that Act mentions both the Constitution and the Constitution of the Act of the Commonwealth of Australia. Section 15.2 is a technical legal instruction to the courts about the way they should handle a federal statute which tries to do something contrary to the Statute of Westminster or the Australia Acts. Apart from the Republic Referendum Bill and the Preamble Referendum Bill, were there any other associated Republic bills in play? Were there? You're about to find out. I'm taking you back to a place in time. We can brag about this if we like. They're very good. They're very good results. But I'm trying to set up what was going on at the time, other than what we, the people, really knew what was going on elsewhere. In mid-1999, all 6 state parliaments passed uniform request legislation to allow the Commonwealth Parliament to amend Section 7 of the Australia Act 1986. This request legislation would not commence unless the 6 November referenda were successful. So for those Australia Act changes to be made lawful, they couldn't do so unless the Republic referendum got up. It was dependent on that. The amendment of Section 7 was necessary to facilitate the establishment of republics at state level. Schedule 1 shows the proposed amendment to the Australia Act 1986 of the Commonwealth. That's the Australian version. So that was setting up to alter the Australian Commonwealth version of the Act. And Schedule 2 shows the proposed amendment to the Australia Act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom. So the New South Wales Parliament, for example, could also change the UK Act as well. So that's what's going on there. Hands up those people who knew anything about these arrangements during referendum time. 1 over there, 2, 3 out of whatever. It's amazing, isn't it? The media didn't tell us. Our elected public servants didn't tell us. Were there any other proposals made in the lead up to the referendum? The answer is yes. The Constitution Request Bill. This was an act to request the amendment of the Statute of Westminster of the Parliament of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act of that Parliament in connection with the proposed constitutional arrangements to establish the Commonwealth of Australia as a republic. The left side of the screen shows details of the powers that would be used to make those changes to the preamble and the covering clauses. The rest is just the running with the Act itself, or the bill. Schedule 1 relates to the Statute of Westminster 1931 of the Parliament of the United Kingdom, and the addition would allow for the omission of the preamble and the repealing of sections 2 to 8. So that's everything between from the preamble down to where it says, and this is the Constitution. So all that history would have been tossed out. That wouldn't please a few people here, I guess. Schedule 2, well, this was to allow those proposed changes to actually be made. So it would be down at that would be the actual authority down at the bottom there, 2 and 3, preamble, omit the preamble, sections 2 through 8, repeal the sections. Now, the good thing about this, nothing happened out of those bills. Only Queensland and Victoria had passed those bills in Parliament. This letter from the then Premier of South Australia, John Olsen, the text on the right is just larger, so it's easier to read. And basically he said as there was not complete agreement between all the states, most of the states decided not to introduce a bill into their parliaments. So I think this is a big wake-up call in that things do happen behind the scenes and we don't get to know what's going on. There are varying views of what can and what cannot be done in respect of the Australia Acts. Back in 2000, Michael Kirby wrote to me indicating that, and this is when he was on the High Court, this is a considerable debate now as to whether the ultimate foundation for the Australian Constitution is the will of the people. And he was in the High Court then. So obviously in the High Court, they're aware of this problem. In an email of 1999 to me from Professor now deceased George Winterton, lovely bloke, Republican though, indicated that theoretically the combination of the Parliament specified in section 15.1 of the Australia Acts, UK, may not be bound by the opening words of section 128, where it's very restrictive of what you can and what you can't change in the Constitution. But he is certain that a High Court would find the way to conclude they are, and that would be the next enemy on the block. He also advised that even the remote possibility of circumventing section 128 should be closed off. I agree, and maybe that's what we should be doing. Finally, Sir Harry Gibbs had also raised some pertinent points alongside this issue, which are worthwhile, they're worthwhile looking at. They included a legal controversy as to whether a referendum carried by a majority of electors in a majority of states would be sufficient to convert Australia to a republic. Additionally, a matter of high political principle is involved. The peoples of the Australian colonies agreed to unite in an indissoluble federal commonwealth under the Crown. That which was solemnly declared to be indissoluble should not be dissolved without consent of the parties to the original compact. Some very wise words indeed. Is there a solution out there? If one has a problem, one ought to have a solution. I have long believed that the Australia Acts were correctly undertaken to secure independence as far as the states are concerned. However, those acts, in my opinion, never gave total sovereignty to the people of Australia and therefore needs to be resolved sooner rather than later. I believe we have a responsibility to leave our Constitution in better order for those that follow us. So I offer the following proposal for consideration. I'm not saying that what I have is right. It's just one idea that might provoke further thought and action on this matter. I know we're running out of time here. On the left is the proposed revised section 127 that I proposed. The option would require further action, that is renaming of the existing schedule and repeal of the sections 51 and 15.2 of both the Australia Acts. Basically what I'm doing is saying we'll put the Australia Act UK, the Australia Act Commonwealth and the Statute of Westminster inner schedules to the Constitution and make them subject to the Constitution rules, i.e. section 128. So if you want to change them, the parliaments can't, but the people can. So this may be another proposal. I know people are very thinking about the preamble, as I am too, but I thought if that move did take place, then it might be right to put in something about the Australia Acts into the preamble. So the existing, so the green bit, nothing's changed. The yellow bit is just changing the enacting words to an historical fact. The blue bit is recognising the achievement, hopeful achievement of putting those three acts into schedules to the Constitution. And the second yellow bit would be a revised enacting words, which would probably give a more Australian flavour to it. Thank you very much for your attention. I know we're running out of time here. That's my website. That's what it looks like. As David has already told you, statusquo.org. And the link to get to my paper is where the top purple arrow is. And you can download the link there. The end. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry.